welcome to Beyond the Scales, That and the Obesity Conversation, where we unravel the complexities of obesity. I'm Emily, and I'm joined by my co-host, Fran.
Hi everyone, we're two medical students on a mission to demystify obesity, as there's so much more to this topic than just a number.
We're joined by a special guest today, Dr Fay Millis, and she is a specialist clinical psychologist in weight management. We're also joined by a regular consultant bariatric surgeon, Mr Lee Humphreys, who's working with us on this podcast.
Nice to see you again, ladies, and thank you very much to Faye for agreeing to join.
Hi everybody, nice to be here and thanks for having me today.
Could you start off by telling us the effects of social media?
I'm really glad you asked that question about social media, because as we already know, social media and media generally have a massive responsibility in their role of how they perpetuate body shape in terms of attractiveness. We know that in our Western society that thinness is associated with female beauty and lean muscle mass is associated with male beauty, and that's kind of hardwired into lots of us, over the last few decades as a model that we should all be aiming for. And the difficulty is that we live in a highly stigmatizing society if we do not reach or aim for those ideals. And social media absolutely has a really big, important part to play in that. Just thinking about the level of stigma that exists in our society, it is through, we have research to show us it's in our workplaces, it's in our education system, it's sadly in our healthcare system. Weight stigma has been shown to be in healthcare professionals, even shown in people, in healthcare professionals who work with people who have obesity. We often have our own internalized weight stigma. People who struggle with weight and have obesity themselves carry a lot of internalized stigma. So it's really prevalent, and it's based on those ideals that media have perpetuated and kind of that are out there. I think Rebecca Paul's research is really helps to elaborate on that point. In terms of discrimination, obesity is seen as the fourth biggest area of discrimination in the States. And that comes after gender, age, and ethnicity. And if you think about the fact that those first three are protected characteristics and the amount of law that's in place to protect those people, and yet we have very little for protection for people who have obesity, and it in many ways is the last kind of health condition that you can have that it's okay just to ridicule in our society, although that is changing over time, and we are slowly developing an understanding that we need to represent our full range of body sizes in media. But the thing that we know is from stigma research is that quite often people with obesity are seen as a burden on the NHS, lazy, gluttonous, unattractive, asexual, uneducated. All of these terms have been found within healthcare professions. Very, very sadly, we became aware in our local area recently that the button on the computer to send a referral through from a GP surgery was, well, I'll let you guess. It was a burger. So that was the symbol on the button from a GP surgery to create a referral through to us at weight management. So stigma is rife, and it's not even questioned. It's an unconscious process. And for many people don't even realize that what they're doing or perhaps saying in appointments could be seen as stigmatizing. So it's really important that we are aware as clinicians, as medics, of our own internalized weight stigma if we have some. And the sad thing about it is we know it doesn't work. Stigmatizing this population just leads people to have less self-esteem, higher levels of anxiety and depression. And in fact, there's research to show us that 5 years post follow-up, if somebody is being teased at school, bullied at school in terms of their weight, they're more likely to have an eating disorder and more likely to have gained weight post 5-year follow-up. So we know it doesn't work. They're also more likely not to be involved in physical activity or in sports as a result.
I was just curious about with the, as part of your management and interventions, do you inform patients about the impact of social media on their weight loss journey and their bariatric surgery journey? Or is it something that's only really discussed if they bring it up?
We talk a lot about the obesogenic environment, and obviously social media is part of that. So we talk a lot about the influences, and then inevitably social media comes into that. I think Lee talks about this in his podcast about you're looking for long-term healthy weight change and healthy lifestyle. And people have been programmed into thinking the quicker you can lose the weight, the better life will be, and the easier life will be, and the happier I'll be, and the more attractive I'll be. But actually, we know that just starts a cycle of potentially binging and restricting, unhealthy eating habits, and yo-yo dieting, which we know ultimately will end up with people putting on more weight than not. So actually, when people come to us, they don't understand why we're not promoting a specific diet, and why we don't label foods as certain colours or red or green or sins or, good foods that you can eat. And we don't use any of that language, because actually what we're trying to create is the understanding that to create a healthy long-term environment and a relationship with food, none of that stuff really helps.
Fay, can I ask you what you think about patients using social media to sort of chart their journey? I mean, in my experience, it's something that I've seen more commonly in patients who've had private bariatric surgery, but we do see it in some of our patients who have had surgery through us on the NHS. And I'm not quite sure how I feel about it. It doesn't really matter how I feel about it because it's not me doing it. But I sort of look at it occasionally from the outside thinking this is a bit of a double-edged sword, but I'd be fascinated on your views on it.
I think it's a case of to what degree and with what intention. So we know that in our psychological therapy work that recording things can be quite helpful. So and help you notice patterns, notice triggers, understand what then to put in place to manage that in terms of how you might want to modify your behaviour and actions in response to some of those. And if you track and record the kind of patterns you're noticing around your weight, that might help you to be able to identify perhaps the things that you want to change and how to improve. The difficulty comes if that starts to become very rigid and non-flexible, and you are starting to monitor things in an unhealthy way that can lead to very strict or unhealthy eating or exercise practices, and that you become quite obsessive in your nature about what that might look like. So weighing yourself twice a day will not give you a representative view of your weight, because we know that there's so much more involved in weight other than fat. It's a question of how it's done and why, rather than whether it's done at all. I think that's probably where I would stand with it, Lee.
How much do you think socio-economic factors come into play with this? So
again, it's another big piece of the jigsaw in terms of our biopsychosocial thinking about somebody. So we know that if you live in one of the areas of the UK that is most deprived, you have a 14% chance more likely of being obese than if you live in one of the more affluent areas. And it's not just that either in terms of socioeconomics and population characteristics. We know that there's relationships between obesity and like we said, socioeconomic status, level of qualification, whether you have a disability or not. and your ethnicity as well. So if you are a Black African woman living in a deprived area with a disability and low educational qualifications, then you are much more likely to have obesity than if you are a white woman living in an affluent area with no disability and a high level of qualification. So socioeconomic factors are really important, and is definitely part of the consideration in terms of the socio part of the model that we would look at. You have to forgive me because I don't know where this example has come from, but I think a really good way of seeing it is it's really important to take all of those population characteristics into account, and this is where blaming the individual and stigmatizing an individual really doesn't work, because if you have one child in a classroom who is perhaps struggling, for example, you might look at that child and say, okay, what's going on for this child? If you have half the class who are perhaps struggling, you might say, oh, what's going on for the teacher in that class, and how the class are interacting with each other. If you have 2/3 of a school that are all struggling with the same thing, you would not point your finger at the individual and say this is an issue. You would be thinking much more about the culture within the school. You may be thinking about what's going on for the school. And yet we have that in our society. 2/3 of our population have weight or obesity issues, and yet we are still stigmatizing and placing responsibility largely on the individual to make change. So it's really important that when you work with somebody who has obesity or weight management issues, that you are thinking about the whole system around them, the whole culture, which can feel quite wide and overwhelming, but is really important.
Yeah, that's I can completely understand the point now. It's really interesting. Have you talk about how there's such a difference socioeconomically? Do you see that in Plymouth? Because Plymouth has got quite intense in a short mile radius of socioeconomic backgrounds. Do you see that here?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a higher, we're slightly over the national statistics for obesity, so and overweight as well. So we absolutely cover all of the socioeconomic kind of levels and diversity within our local area. Absolutely.
Just to round things off, I mean, one of the aims of this podcast is obviously to try and educate people. And I think one of the difficulties medical students and indeed lots of doctors have is actually approaching people in the right way to talk to them about obesity. And as you will know, as do I, that if that initial conversation is handled badly, then that really sets the patient up for, really not wanting to interact with medical professionals around their weight. So have you got some top tips for how to approach this subject for somebody who's maybe not as experienced in it as you or I?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's a really important question. So the first thing I would say to any medical students is become aware of your own stigmatized views if you have them. And that can be quite hard to own, but definitely become aware of your own internal weight bias stigma. There's quite a good website where you can do a very quick test to identify internalized weight stigma, which we're not always consciously aware of. I'd really encourage, and I can send you the information for that, I'd really encourage medical students to jump on that quickly. It's not the be all and end all, but it's a really good way of starting the discussions. I would be thinking very carefully about the language that I use. And when people come into the room, and Lee, I think you touched on this in your previous podcast, I would be letting people know from the outset that I understand that obesity is far more complex than eat less and move more. And I would be showing an active interest in to understanding what that means what more there is that is creating a weight management difficulty or an obesity condition in the people that come into the room. So I would be, what we know from user groups is that people prefer the term weight over the medical term of obesity. People don't like to hear the word morbidly obese. That can really trigger feelings for people and can be really difficult for people to hear. I'd be really sensitive about the language that I use. So just generally making sure that I'm checking out with people if it's okay to kind of use certain terms and certain phrases. Some user groups we know of have reclaimed the word fat. So they now want to use that word fat, which is historically been quite a pejorative word. So just being really sensitive and checking out what people are comfortable with. I would also be thinking practically as well. So for many people, it is an experience, an obesity experience, just to come to the place where they've come to see you for that appointment. So people may have really struggled with parking because they haven't been able to find a space where they've been able to open a door. We have people that haven't been able to attend their appointments because they haven't been able to park in a place that they could open the door enough to be able to get out of the car to come to their appointments. So I would be really asking people about those kinds of things when they come in, particularly if I wanted to start a discussion. I would be thinking about the layout of my room. I'd be thinking about, have you got bariatric chairs in your waiting room? Have you got chairs that are easily accessible and bariatric in your clinic room? Do you know the weight of the weight of the bed that you have in your room? What kind of weight limit does that need and have? Because that's what the person struggling with obesity will instantly be coming in to kind of scout out. Will I be able to lie on this bed without, falling in a way that's going to cause me more injury? The person that you see was likely to be very embarrassed or apologising for themselves if they have a high level of internalised weight stigma. So just very simple things like making sure that they can they don't have to walk around lots of equipment to sit down in the bariatric chair. Those kinds of things really make a difference to the engagement level that you can get from somebody and what you are then able to do in terms of starting a discussion with people around their weight.
They're excellent tips, and we'll definitely put the stigma survey in the description. So definitely fill that in and do see what yours is.
The one other thing I was going to say is there's also an excellent video that's hot off the press, really, from King's College London that really explains a lot about why obesity happens for people and really pulls together a lot of what we've talked about in this podcast. And it's 6 minutes long. I'd absolutely recommend all medical students to watch that video because it will give you a really rounded view of what people are trying to manage. And it's an excellent resource for people to give to their family and friends as well, anyone that maybe is carrying weight stigmatized views. So I can include that link as well and you can have a look.
Faye, look, I just want to round off by saying thank you very much for your time. I think this has probably been the best episode we've done to date, mainly because I've done far less talking. I think you've exploded so many myths, you've answered so many questions, and you've made it very clear that we don't employ psychologists in weight management just to manage the surgeons, which is what a lot of my family think. And so I just want to extend our thanks to you for joining us on this. I'm really excited by the content. I think it's been a fantastic episode. So thank you very, very much.